Välkomna till Kungliga Vetenskapsakademin och den här presskonferensen då vi ska presentera Sveriges riksbankspris i ekonomisk vetenskap till Alfred Nobels minne för 2022. Welcome to the Royal Swedish Academy of Sciences and this press conference when we'll announce this year's Sveriges riksbanks prize in economic sciences in memory of Alfred Nobel for 2022. We will keep to our tradition and begin the presentation in Swedish, and then we will take it in English. And you are, of course, welcome to ask questions in either of these languages afterwards. Jag heter Hans Ellegren och är ständig sekreterare här vid Kungliga Vetenskapsakademin. Till höger om mig sitter professor Tore Ellingsen. Han är ordförande i kommittén för Sveriges riksbankspris i ekonomisk vetenskap till Alfred Nobels minne. Och till vänster, professor John Hassler, ledamot i priskommittén och sakkunnig i ämnet. My name is Hans Ellegren. I'm Secretary General of the Royal Swedish Academy of Sciences. And to my right is Professor Tore Ellingsen. He's chair of the committee for the Sveriges Riksbanks Prize in Economic Sciences in memory of Alfred Nobel. And to my left, Professor John Hassler, member of the committee and expert in this field. Årets pris handlar om banker. This year's prize is about banks. Kungliga Vetenskapsakademin har idag beslutat att utdela Sveriges riksbankspris i ekonomisk vetenskap till Alfred Nobels minne för 2022 i lika delar till professor Ben Bernanke, the Brookings Institution, Washington DC, USA, till professor Douglas Diamond, University of Chicago, USA, och till professor Philip Dybvig, Washington University in St. Louis, USA. Det tilldelas priset för forskning om banker och finanskriser. The Royal Swedish Academy of Sciences has today decided to award Sveriges riksbanksprize in economic sciences in memory of Alfred Nobel for 2022 to Ben Bernanke, the Brookings Institution, Washington DC, USA, Douglas Diamond, Washington University in the University of Chicago, in USA, and Philip Dybvig at Washington University in St. Louis, USA. They obtained the prize for research on banks and financial crises. Professor Tore Ellingsen will now give us a short summary of the field. Please.
We didn't know it at the time, but 15 years ago, much of the world stood at the brink of a devastating economic crisis. Most of us were unprepared for it. However, a few academic economists were both prepared and worried. They had studied the theory of bank runs. They believed the evidence in its favor, and they suspected that the possibility of runs was yet again becoming relevant. As events unfolded in 2008, 9 and 10, new evidence piled up in favor of the theory. In a nutshell, the theory says that banks can be tremendously useful, but they are only guaranteed to be stable if they are properly regulated.
Thank you, Tore. I now leave the word to Professor Hassler, who will give a more detailed presentation of this year's prize. Please, John.
Thank you. So banks are for basically all of us a part of daily life. Most of the time banks and the banking system works well, but sometimes part of it, or perhaps even the whole system fails. Banks go under and a self-propelling downward spiral can start, leading to catastrophic consequences and even financial crisis. So financial crises are dramatic events. people run to the banks, bank runs appear. This can lead to banks failing, and this can spread like a wildfire to other banks and actually to the rest of the world. And we know that the consequences of these series of events are very dramatic, and they can also be quite long. We have seen these things happening in history many times, but we have also seen that it can happen during modern times in our economy today. So when you think about the consequences of financial crisis, and in particular about the central role that banks play, many questions arise. Couldn't we do without banks? Do we really need to have them? Is it the case that banks are inherently unstable, or is there some flaw in the construction of banks that could be fixed? When banks fail, couldn't new banks quickly arise, taking over the old customers so that the economy could start to be operative quickly again? And we also hear that banks create money. Is that even legal? And when we think about the consequences of bank runs and bank failures, wouldn't it be possible to change the system, to introduce measures that make the system more stable so we don't see these dramatic events? Modern banking theory addresses and answers all these questions, and it rests on three fundamental contributions by the laureates this year. So let me now start to talk a little bit about the actual contribution that we recognize today. So Ben Bernanke, in a paper from 1983, showed with statistical analysis and historical sources that bank runs led to bank failures, and this was the mechanism that turned a relatively ordinary recession into the depression in the 30s, the world's most dramatic and severe crisis that we have seen in modern history. So he showed that banks need to be there. They need to be up and running for the economy to work. And if they don't, then the economy works worse, much worse. During the Depression, the income and production plummeted, the unemployment skyrocketed, and as we know, the whole thing spread to the rest of the world. At the time when Bernanke published this, this was a break with the current views. Of course, people had seen that banks failed, but it was more thought as consequence of the crisis rather than cause of the crisis. But now, the views of Bernanke have become the conventional wisdom and has received lots of solid empirical report during later times. Simon Debwig, in a paper in 1983, showed that banks are perfectly constructed to make sure that savings are transferred to productive investments. They do that by stepping in as an intermediary, a middleman, solving a quite natural conflict between savers and borrowers. And that conflict is that borrowers, they want to have liquid assets, they want to have access to their savings, while, did I say borrowers? Of course I mean savers, they want to have access to their savings all the time. And on the other hand, borrowers that make investments in, say, homes or in factories, they need to have a long-term commitment. So banks step in by doing what is called maturity transformation. And they then accept deposits from savings that savers can have access to continuously, and they transform that into long-term assets, the lending to households and firms. So in a sense you could say that this is creating liquidity, creating money, not from thin air, but from the long-term assets, the lending that the banks do. So this was part of the paper. What they also show in this paper is that this maturity transformation is inherently vulnerable. If a rumor starts that people are going to take out their money from the bank, then everyone has an incentive to rush to the bank to take out money in time and not come last in line for taking out the money. And this can create failing banks. And this is something that's inherent in the maturity transformation. So maturity transformation is important, but it's also vulnerable. Diamond, he showed that banks are also perfectly constructed to serve another important purpose, and that is to monitor the borrowers. And they do that on behalf of the savers, again as a middleman between, an intermediary between the savers and the borrowers. So banks can do this in an efficient way, reducing the cost of credit and making it possible to finance more productive investments in society. The problem with this is that this monitoring requires knowledge about the borrowers. This is built up during the relation with the bank. And when the bank fails, this knowledge disappears and cannot easily be transferred to other banks. And that is why it's difficult for new banks to take over their own customers. And this is a reason for why banking crises tend to have very long-lasting consequences. So what's the importance of all this for society? Well, as I said, the laureates have provided a foundation for our modern understanding of why banks are needed, why they're vulnerable, and what to do about it. So in the laureates' work, it's shown that deposit insurance is a way of short-circuiting the dynamic behind bank runs. So with deposit insurance, there's no need to run to the bank, and bank runs don't really need to start. They also show that liquidity provision, lending of last resort from the central bank is a way of dealing with this. So the ideas that we today recognize have proven to be invaluable also in modern times. During, for example, the financial crisis, when the laureates' work turned out to be important to understand what was the cause of the crisis. And during that time, by the way, also one of the laureates, Ben Bernanke, was the head of the US Central Bank, the Federal Reserve. So the measures that were undertaken rests on the ideas that we recognize today. And we can also note that even though the financial crisis had large consequences, neither that nor the COVID pandemic led to depressions like in the 30s. So society is changing, and financial markets too. New agents come up, new financial instruments come up all the time. But the need to construct rules and understand the financial markets in order to reduce the risk of financial crisis and to prevent them into turning into depression, that need.
Александр Иванович Бастрыкин доложил о первых результатах расследования диверсии, совершенной на Крымском мосту. Данные криминалистической и других экспертиз, а также оперативная информация говорят о том, что взрыв, устроенный 8 октября, это террористический акт. Теракт, направленный на разрушение граждан